Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the transmission. Best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, geopoliticsandempire.substack.com. A little over $9 a month or a little over $90 a year or more. You can always put in whatever amount you like. We do private weekly group Zoom chats to shoot the breeze on current events, and I do a weekly write-up of all of the headlines of the week and my commentary and thoughts, which many people are enjoying. There's a bit of humor in there as well. I try to be funny because the world is burning all around us, and you could either cry or laugh. And you can also send donations. Thanks. Someone this morning, bought me 200 tacos and buy me a coffee. Thank you so much. You can also send munitions through Donor Box for Wise. Purchase a console if you want to chat with me, and do check out the affiliates. Escape the Technocracy. If you use the code Geopolitics, you get 15% off. Fantastic course on, working to make your life more private. Legal Shield, a great service. Wise Wolf Gold, above phone, easydns.com. So check those out on geopoliticsandempire.com. Leave a review if you haven't for the podcast. And it's been a while. Returning to the transmission is Jack Buffington, who's the director of the supply chain and sustainability practices for First T Consulting, a global consulting firm, and he's director of the supply chain program at the University of Denver. In his research and practice, he's advocated for a balance of policy, science, and supply chain to achieve global sustainability and economic growth. He's published over 20 peer-reviewed journal articles and 8 nonfiction business books, winning various awards. Last time we discussed his book, I've got a copy here on my Kindle, Reinventing Supply Chain, a 21st Century Covenant for America. Fantastic book. He's got others such as Peak Plastic, The Recycling Myth, and he's got a new one as well, Environmental Innovation, an action plan for saving the economy and the planet by 2050. Welcome back, Jack.
Right. It's nice to see you. Can I come down and help you eat those 200 tacos?
Yes. It'll be quite a while, to get through those. But congrats on the new book, and there's so much is going on. And you wrote to me not long ago discussing. You were featured in an article. You were quoted in Reuters. It was an article titled "China Bond Market Opening Offers No Panacea to Debt-Laden African States," and you said that if U.S. policy does not address the weaknesses in its present approach to supply chains, including capital markets and currency, it could devastate the economy over time, including America's role in globalization. And so, on my podcast, I have different guests from all over the planet, and we are definitely in an age of great transition. And so what's your pulse? What's your take on where we are?
I mean, what really concerns me is it's a slow transition. It's so slow that people aren't noticing it. So in the article, I talked about, how China is trying to change the nature of the supply chain. If you don't mind, maybe I'll take 20 seconds and talk about how supply chains work from a flow standpoint. And so there really are 3 flows within the supply chain. There are goods, the goods that go across the planet. There's information and financials or money. Now, the problem with what I just said there is that money has historically been used, as you know, as a transaction, a mode of transaction. And right now, money has been financialized. And so the role of money is bigger than just a transaction between a buyer and a seller and how it works in supply chain. And what we're seeing happen right now is the transition of this role of money. And in the United States, what should concern us is globalization has been built upon the US dollar. So the US dollar is the de facto currency for oil and for a lot of other industries. And so what's happening is China is trying to change this because they know that as long as the world continues to transact almost entirely in US dollars, it's going to impact their ability to influence the supply chain. So they're trying to offer options when it comes to investments and currencies and everything like that. So we're seeing this transition. And what I noted in the article is it's not going to happen now in Africa, but it's the beginning of the process. And my concern of it is that U.S. policymakers aren't sufficiently focused on this.
Yeah, you're right. In the article, just read from it. You said African states are looking closer trade ties with China. It could tap the market. Most of the African nations have a potential for growth in manufacturing and supply chain, are interested in having balance within both the U.S. and China spheres of influence. And I'm bringing up topics from all over the place, but I was reading. I'm here in Mexico, and I'm reading yesterday in the papers. It's almost a similar story, whether it's China and Africa, and they want to balance with U.S. and China, and here in Mexico, and they're pulled in both directions. China, U.S. and Wall Street Journal discussed the other day that the Mexican administration, Sheinbaum, wants the U.S. help to reduce Mexico's imports from China, and so I guess they want tighter integration with North America. But at the same time, they're flooding in Chinese EVs. I read there, $1 billion worth of Chinese smart homes are going to begin to be built in the northern part of Mexico. And so it's kind of like, which way is the wind blowing? It's not clear for me.
Yeah, you just did a tour around the world. So let me try to keep up with you. I think Africa is a really important region of the world for a couple of reasons. One is of the world's 193 nations, 2/3 of them have a declining population rate. The Sub-Saharan region of Africa is the only region in the world that has a positive growth rate projected over the next couple of decades, which is important from a supply chain standpoint for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of opportunities in Africa. And I think the Africans are right to kind of look at this as we would like to do business with both the Chinese and the Americans. But there's these challenges with currencies and how markets work and everything like that. You mentioned Mexico, which is another interesting example, because as the supply chain split between the United States and China, because neoliberal globalization is coming to an end, it's becoming this two spheres of influence, the East and the West. Mexico is in a really peculiar or very difficult situation because that's one country that has the greatest opportunity for benefit in this split between the China and the United States. We talked about this last time when I was on your podcast, and that Mexico is becoming this sophisticated aspect of the supply chain, so much so that they need other countries in South America and Latin America to play the role that Mexico has traditionally played in the United States. So there's amazing opportunities in Mexico. And then you also have the whole sustainability element to it. And of electric vehicles that are produced in the world, China makes enough electric vehicles to provide for the entire world. And so they have so much capacity because they process lithium, they've perfected the battery from a production standpoint. And so they're making more. So basically, sending electric vehicles around the world. And they are actually really good cars, those in China, and they're really inexpensive. So if there were no tariffs included, you could get an electric vehicle in Mexico or the United States for like $9,000, $8,000, which is a really good car. And so the challenge is the president of Mexico is by nature an engineer and an environmentalist. She wants the economy to move in that direction. You also have a car that's very affordable. However, from an automotive standpoint, Mexico is key to the U.S. automotive market. And so Mexico's got to be really careful about going too far with that.
Yeah, it's fascinating though. It's a real paradox here in Mexico, because I also read, I think Foxconn, they're going to open up this NVIDIA right here where I live in Guadalajara. They're going to open up a factory for NVIDIA. But at the same time, you get mayors having their heads chopped off. Literally like a few days ago, mayor, 6 days after entering office, 3 days, his secretary gets assassinated, and then 3 days later, his decapitated head is found in the pickup. And then politicians are being robbed in broad daylight on the highways here in Mexico. So it's just like, how does foreign direct investment look? 50 every day, 50 semis are being hijacked in Mexico, which is, any thought on that when it comes to supply chains? Because it really irks me what these cartels and criminals are doing, because on one hand, they're shooting themselves in the foot. They're destroying the potential. Mexico has such great potential. I mean, Tesla's coming in, NVIDIA, you name it. Just any thoughts on this sort of situation, whether it's in Mexico or other parts of the world, insecurity, war, and so
Yeah,
forth?
so if we isolate on Mexico, it is really sad. That is probably the one limiting factor for Mexico's. I mean, Mexico could literally become the supply chain powerhouse, because the Western Hemisphere is really gonna burden. So an example of how the cartels are getting involved is there's a lot of lithium which is needed for these batteries in Latin America and South America, and I think the cartels are like overtaking a lot of this. So it is really difficult. I mean, it's bad enough the challenge that businesses face with government. And on top of that, you add the cartels, and there's similar challenges in Africa. In that, one challenge with Africa is there's 8 uniquely different biomes, which prevents like contiguous infrastructure. There's mountains, deserts, which has led to a lot of communities, which prevents large scale production and consumption and everything like that. And so, I think what's like what I talked about last time in your podcast is the whole nature of the value proposition of supply and demand, because that's what supply chains are, right? I mean, the goal of supply chain is to grow the economy through this multiplier effect between supply and demand, is to focus on a community-based supply chain so that the consumption and the production are balanced in that region and multiply as a function of that. And then these supply chains can become networked, because we face so many geopolitical challenges, and it's very difficult for companies to keep up with what's happening. You probably also know like the challenges we face in the United States. In just the last 2 weeks, we had a hurricane that went 300 miles inland, which is pretty unique that it went so far inland. But what's unique about 300 miles inland is the IV solutions, IVs that you use for hospitals, for dialysis and everything like that, when you have surgeries and so forth. 60% of all IV fluid solutions were produced in this one factory in North Carolina that was taken offline for over a week. Now, luckily for the United States, supply, even though we're having challenges right now, it wasn't structurally damaged. There wasn't a problem with the water aquifer. 4 days later, more than half the ports in the United States go on strike for 3 days. And so that disrupted the supply chain. And then 4 days later, there was another major hurricane. And so here you and I are talking about cartels. We're talking about weather. We're talking about, like all these different challenges. And this leads to instability. And the world is too big of a place when it comes to creating a supply chain and balancing what's good for the people and what's good for business. And so I think what you're going to see is that move closer in to try to stabilize some of these challenges that we face.
So you are seeing what you were saying earlier. Is that trend moving forward where, it's China, it's US, and these companies that they are moving closer to home, like NVIDIA,
Right.
in basing itself. Guadalajara is the Silicon Valley, they say, of Mexico. And so, you having NVIDIA, Tesla going into Nuevo Leon. I've read, Korean semiconductor companies have visited to look at the prospects of setting up shop here. So that's that nearshoring process. And you mentioned there's this bifurcation of East and West. And so the East is doing it, the West is doing it. So is that the general trend where you see things going more local?
Well, strategically, yes. So what you just talked about was semiconductors. And so Guadalajara in the United States, the whole Phoenix, Tempe, that area has been, given a lot of investment. So you're seeing that happen when it comes to strategic things such as semiconductors, but you're not seeing the same thing happen in other areas of the supply chain. And the area that most concerns me is healthcare. For example, we have, massive concentration of something in this US factory. And there's also a massive concentration of pharmaceuticals and still in parts of China and India. And so, yeah, I'd say when it comes to semiconductors, I mean, people always talk about nearshoring. You're seeing that change because that's strategic to geopolitics. But things that I am more concerned about is, this week, certain hospitals in the United States had to push back surgeries or find creative ways to get people their dialysis or things like that, which impacts most people's lives. So, yeah, you're seeing it change in some ways, but unfortunately not in others.
Yeah, in my weekly roundup on my Substack, I mentioned two articles. One was from Wall Street Journal. Um, it's titled here it is. Despite geopolitical tensions, China is big business for Western consulting firms. But another one was from Peter Coy, New York Times. Breaking up with China is hard to do, and I kind of likened it. There's that fable of the frog and the scorpion. That crosses the river, and basically, I feel like the scorpion is the U.S. and the frog is China, and they're both. It's like their fates are now intertwined in many ways. And I didn't want to just backtrack for a second because you mentioned the EVs in China. And what are your thoughts? There's news today. I haven't had time to digest it completely, but Elon Musk, was it last night, unveiled a self-driving robo-van and Optimus robots. And so is sort of this tech space going to be divided, you think, into two, basically the Chinese version, and is Elon Musk and Tesla, the West's version of that, and how will they compete?
Yeah. So one thing to go back to China, like you were saying, is having spent time there and worked there. One thing I really don't quite understand is I know there's geopolitics involved and everything like that, but I think China really does have significant problems related to their economy right now. They have a declining population. They have a real estate bubble. And so what they're trying to do is like lean on what they're good at, and that's mass manufacturing. So, but the challenge that we don't understand, when you talk about Elon Musk versus China is good engineering comes from good manufacturing. And so we're falling behind in the next generation of vehicles because we don't do as much production there as they do, as well as understanding how the overall supply chain operates. So, I think and the other thing to understand is I think Tesla is not doing so well. It's not, it was the number one car company in China, and now it's really declining in its production, and it's declining here in the United States as well. So, I think the moral of the story is that good production, good manufacturing leads to good engineering, and good engineering leads to good solutions.
I see time to time some Teslas here in Guadalajara. I saw a Cybertruck for the first time the other day, and I laughed out loud as I was driving because it's the first time you see the Cybertruck in a place like for me here in Guadalajara, Mexico, and right behind him was a cop with the lights on, and I'm sure the cop because it's a strange vehicle, you don't usually see it, and I bet you the guy was out to extort the Cybertruck. He wanted a bribe, just say, give me money or I'm going to, this is a strange vehicle, I'm going to tow it or whatever. So anyways, it's just another day in the life of Mexico. What you mentioned earlier, I think currencies and payments, there's all this talk of the BRICS world now. We have the meeting in Kazan coming up. They talk about BRICS parliament, BRICS based currency. How's that going to affect globalization and America's standing? Because I think what you said was correct. It's this transition. I think it's going to take some time, unless it's something. I also am open to the possibility there can be some drastic event that just causes things to accelerate overnight or in a week's space of time. But thoughts on BRICS world and these other transitions?
Yeah. Well, back to the currency thing is it's hard for people to wrap their heads around that money is just basically information. It's a transactional instrument. And yet, if you look at the West's dominance when it comes to supply chains, it's based on financial markets. And so even today, the British pound is a pretty significant currency, even though their economy is not, very productive. And so I think it really comes down to, I think this basket of currencies is not what people are. I mean, it's not. It's. I think it's more of a gimmick than anything. The problem with that is, like, if an African country was going to trade in this sort of currency, they would also have to have reserves associated with it. And a lot of these economies don't have enough, you know, financial resources in order to have currencies and, you know, like to have dollar reserves and renminbi reserves and, you know, all these different currencies, which is the challenge of like the basket of currencies. So I think people don't quite understand that, you know, a lot of this relates to reserves in order to be able to float these currencies relative to their own currency. Yeah, that's where I think crypto blockchain really comes into play. Because really what you're doing there is you're moving towards what money used to be. And that's you make corn, you grow corn, I grow cattle. You want one of my cattle, so you give me a piece of paper, which is a promissory note. When your corn is ready, you're going to send me the corn. And it's basically just information. It's not intended to, you know, you think about like how business is changing with, you know, venture capital for private equity sort of business where you make your money on the financialization aspect of it as opposed to the production, supply and demand side of it. So I think that's the benefit of blockchain. Now, the challenge with that relative to governments is governments will have to release their control over that transactional process in order to be able to have that happen. So America doesn't want to do that. Why would they when they have Wall Street and the dollar is the world's currency? China would want to do it to release the world from the dollar, but China doesn't want to have a currency that their government can't control. And so that's the real dilemma that's going on right now. But I think what you'll probably start to see happen is as blockchain becomes prominent and it becomes reliable, that private companies are just going to use that as their means of transaction and avoid currency markets altogether. I think that would be good for the whole supply chain of supply and demand because you take the financialization out of the equation.
I got a whole bunch of questions here. Just your first comment on BRICS. I think you've got a point because Brent Johnson, the Santiago Fund, follows me on X. He's interesting. He's very bullish on the dollar and not so much on BRICS, and he pokes fun. And I got this story from him the other day where he was joking. I was joking that the BRICS payment system is really coming along because they say it's a commodity based, right? Commodity based, gold back, whatever, commodity based. And did you know it's going to be backed by chickpeas, lentils, and tangerines and rice? Because there was this article from Russian TASS that Russia agrees to accept payment in Pakistani tangerines amid payment difficulties. So now Russia is, it's gone so like backward that they're getting paid now in chickpeas and lentils, tangerines and rice, which is kind of absurd. And so it's not very futuristic. But also just on the blockchain, I just read this morning, XRP Ripple, one of these cryptocurrencies, they just donated $1 million to Kamala Harris. And what do you think this future sort of blockchain, supply chain payment type system will be? I think you're onto something because I've seen in the past few years, different parts of the world, Kazakhstan, where I used to live. I had a guest on my old TNT show, Mark Yeftovich, who's also affiliate EasyDNS. He's up in Canada. He's a crypto guy. He said that many countries will begin to use private solutions. They won't develop, like for CBDCs, they're not going to develop them themselves because it costs a lot of money. And so like a week later, and he said Ethereum would be one. And I think it was the central bank of, I forget, Norway or somewhere up there, that they were testing out as their basis for CBDCs, one of the Ethereum-based blockchain. Kazakhstan looked at Binance. XRP wants to get in the game. So you think is that how it might go, where governments might just take off the shelf these or start using these more private solutions?
Yeah. So I mean, I'll give you an analogy to solar energy. Centralized approach to solar energy, centralized approach to money is, the government regulating and managing it, as opposed to you could use solar energy in your own array and you would need to be a part of that centralization of it. And so my concern with any technology is does the technology enable freedom of markets for entrepreneurs to succeed? Where if blockchain was truly open source, centralized, decentralized, and you and I could trade fluently without any sort of encumbrances, right? And it wouldn't even matter, what, to certain, I guess, it gets complicated is if you live in a country where there's tariffs and so forth, right? That's where it gets really complicated. And I think a lot, like if government agencies take responsibility and control of this, then it simply goes from being the next form of virtual currency, but it's still controlled within that sort of financial model where currencies are financialized as opposed to utilized as transactions. And I think, the country that I live in, the United States, my goal, what I think it needs to be about is more production and more production happening in this country, as opposed to too much of the economy based on financialization. So that's my one fear of that whole thing is it becomes financialized as opposed to what I see blockchain as this centralized, decentralized, fluid transaction system where I can create supply chains connected to anyone in the world.
That point, many people have. It's just common sense. What you said. We basically we need to bring more manufacturing back to America. And I've been reading in past weeks. Was it Robert Gates, the DoD? I forget if he's retired. He wrote an opinion piece for whatever, a WSJ or something, saying. And I keep seeing these pieces every week that. And the defense, just as using defense as example, you see this trend where they're saying we can't build out ships anymore. I mean, China's going crazy on that front in terms of they have the biggest navy now, and they're churning stuff out, and we can't do that. And so they're complaining that for defense purposes, we don't have the manufacturing. As you mentioned, a lot of medicines is in China. Food, I don't know what's going on with agriculture. And so I think this is very important. Do you think we're moving in that direction in the U.S.?
No, I think we still have the long tail. So there's the model of economics that we use. So I mean, you know this that the whole discipline of economics is based on the model of scarcity. When economics started in the 18th century, we never had, we just didn't have enough of things, right? I mean, the world GDP was basically nothing because there was always more demand than supply. We live in a world today where there's more supply than demand. We just talked about the China EV model. They're flooding the world market with EVs because they have so much production capacity. And the challenge we face here is that that there's just not that balance between this supply and demand. Just the companies, you grow your supply chain through concentration. You grow your supply chain by getting bigger, which leads to economic growth, but it doesn't lead to equal economic growth across the world. And so that's the reason why globalization is losing air, because countries are like, hey, I'm losing out on the globalization side. And that's my point is that, like, how do we bring it back to, economics is no longer a model of scarcity. Economics is now a model of having too much of everything. Too much of everything, but not enough value proposition within it. So, I think it's just a new model of economics that we need, and it needs to be taken away from financialization. It needs to be taken, enabling people to trade in a way where you create that multiplier effect that we used to have when supply chains were growing.
It makes me think of the Amazon model, where these big tech companies or Silicon Valley, their goal is to basically get a monopoly, right? They're in first, and initially they're at a loss, right? They're losing, but their goal is to get the monopoly, and if they get that, everyone else will eventually be gone. And I mean, I'm just impressed in the last few years in Mexico, like how Amazon has come in, and other such, even Uber, all these American Silicon Valley big tech companies, they're creating a monopoly in their respective genres. And so would that be sort of an example where Amazon first bleeds just to get a monopoly on the market, and then they're the only kid on the block?
Yeah, so it's a technology monopoly, right? And so and I think I talked about this, last time. Your audience probably hated this idea of a community-based supply chain. And basically what I'm saying is that so big tech is monopolizing technology, and as a result of that, companies like Amazon can basically corner the market because there's the best. They have the most data centers. They have the best technology, and so my concept of the community-based supply chain is you you have a community purchase the technology that would be a de facto utility, which will allow the community to create enterprises within that community. It's the only way that individual entrepreneurs can compete against big companies like Amazon, because any sort of single individual is not going to have the capital to compete against this trillion-dollar company. So you have to create this public-private partnership. And then like the term community makes someone think that it's socialism. It's not. What you're basically doing, it'd be almost like in the beginning of the United States Industrial Revolution, you had to have the communities put in sewer systems and electricity grids and everything like that to allow these companies to be able to create factories. And so, in order for people like me and you and people that, small entrepreneurs to compete against Amazon, they need to have a similar capital infrastructure to compete. Or otherwise, these supply chains keep getting bigger and entrepreneurs are pushed out of the picture.
No, I think most people would agree, or listeners would agree with your perspective. I think most people listening, we're all on Geopolitics and Empire. I hope we're more for freedom, liberty, prosperity, decentralization, the opposite of centralization and monopoly. And so I think, as you call it, the community-based supply chain.
But I think where people get hung up is the community aspect of it. It's like, oh, you're going to because it is a question. Like I've been working on this topic with certain municipalities, and it's very difficult to convey this idea to a community because that's just not how government operates. And so, the challenge there is how do you, and because basically what we're talking about is supply and demand, labor and capital, right? And so how do you optimize those four variables within an area that can grow? Because, one thing I noted in the book I just wrote, Environmental Innovation, is that the reason why all these environmental strategies haven't worked is two reasons. One is the world doesn't solve problems as a global community. There's no concept of that. Like that's just a dream and a myth, right? And the other problem with sustainability programs is that most of the world's population is too poor to focus on something as conceptual as that. Most of the people in the world are focusing only on what's good for them. Okay, so if we take those two ideas and we say, okay, the world can't solve problems as a global community. From a social anthropology standpoint, people have solved problems within communities, right? Because the community bonds together, they share resources, they make sure that the community next to them is not going to take everything away from them. And so what you created there is a shared bond within that community to create entrepreneurship. The world can't do that. Like, there was the dream at the beginning of the 21st century. Thomas Friedman wrote this book, The World is Flat, that now we live in this neoliberal paradise where everybody's going to have the same opportunities. And it was a folly then, but now we know it's a folly. And so the question is, what do we do to fix that? And so that's where my point is that, like, how do we get these communities to come together to balance capital and labor and supply and demand? And so I'm trying to make that work, but it's a paradigm shift in how we think about how markets work and how supply chains work.
I was just trying to think. Would one example be, you've got the Uber app, which is popular now here where I am, Mexico, and used to have a lot of the yellow taxis. They're still around, but I see them less. And they used to have their sitios. They're like little sites in different parts of the town. And now I pass by and they're not there anymore. And I know in some places, I don't know if it was in Mexico or in other countries, where the government tried to work with these local taxi drivers to develop their own version, like of a local app, so they can compete with Uber. Would that sort of be somewhat of an example of what you're talking about, where you're helping the local community businesses compete with these big globalized businesses?
So when you talk about what's happening in Mexico and the United States, is that there's certain places like where you live that's becoming a tech hub, and there's certain places where we live there's a tech hub. But the city I grew up in, Baltimore, Maryland, has been languishing for 50 years, and so there's no investment going into certain parts of these places. And the question is, if you live in these communities, what do you do about it? And so the point is more so than the app is to build the infrastructure for entrepreneurship. And so that's where you build this blockchain system, you build this 3D printing. You basically take the technology today that is owned by the big companies, by Google, Amazon, IBM, companies like that, and you invest those technologies within the community. And then you go back to the people in the community and say, we're investing in these technologies for you to become entrepreneurs. And so now what we need to do is we need to teach you how to enter into the digital economy, because, to your example of the taxi cab driver, these guys don't know how to do any of this stuff, right? So you need to have the infrastructure in place and the education in place so that people can develop within their own area. Because otherwise they just become on the outside, or they just become consumers, and that's what's happening in these communities. I mean, there's communities in Mexico and there's communities in the United States that it's just there's nothing, right? And so there's no opportunities for people. So basically what this becomes is using technology to create an opportunity zone, because those areas are being left out right now.
And to go back to what we were discussing earlier, you were talking about China and Africa, China and in Mexico, and sort of this bifurcated world. How do you see this future of, I've had John Perkins on. I think I've interviewed him over the years 4 or 5 times, but he's got an interesting book. It's his third version, I think, of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where he updated it with China, some chapters on China. And he says, China has been using the same model that Western globalism has since Bretton Woods, which was the IMF, World Bank, get countries into debt, knowing they'll never be able to pay off the debt, and then grab their collateral. He says China is using debt diplomacy, but it's not as bad as the Western version. They're still building bridges and infrastructure and stuff like that. So it's a less worse version of it. He said, but how do you sort of see this future of globalization? Is it going to be one where you see, for example, in Mexico, you're going to have both China and America in, or will one eventually get kicked out? Or is it going to just be this sort of struggle? Just thoughts on the future of globalization in that sense.
Yeah, so let me share with you a project that I'm working on in Africa right now. So fingers crossed, it's taken 6 months to work on this to get trust, because I think a lot of leaders in Africa are concerned about just what you said relative to investment from the U.S. or investment from China. And the truth of the matter is a lot of investment has been made in the continent, and it hasn't been very successful. And the reason why it hasn't been very successful is that a lot of these investments are being deployed in a manner of something that works in other places. So if you think about an infrastructure investment in the United States, it's one contiguous continent, so to speak. Geographically, it's really easy to create infrastructure because it's just wide open areas, right? You don't have any sort of differences in languages. You don't have differences in cultures. And meanwhile, in Africa, it's like 56 different countries. It's 8 different geographical biomes. So large scale capital infrastructure projects fail because, number one, you have problems with tribes and culture and language and infrastructure. And there's been a lot of money that's been pumped into these places where that have failed. And so this kind of ties to this model I'm talking about is if you can just create a model of an economic zone, self-reliance economic zone using technology for one community, and then you can network them to other communities. So it's a different approach to infrastructure and investment because China, to your point, to what John Perkins is saying, is the approach to infrastructure is still large scale traditional capital projects. But historically, in a lot of developing countries, those have failed. And then you get into this problem of the debt trap. And so I think the fact that China and other countries are creating terms for failed projects is a symptom in comparison to the root cause problem. And the root cause problem is how we do investment in these places. And at these places, large scale capital investment doesn't succeed. And so taking a different approach, I think will lead to success.
Yeah, the question of corruption and money that just disappears. I wonder if blockchain, I'm very skeptical of a lot of digital technocracy, but what if, blockchain is able somehow to deal with the transparency and corruption aspect where it will be known where that money goes. It wouldn't be as easily pocketed by officials, no?
Yeah, no technology is perfect, and every technology is susceptible to additional nefarious and corrupt acts, right? But like my thought is there's parts of the world that really are looking for change. And so if you move from a model of IMF large scale infrastructure investments to large scale Belt and Road infrastructure, and then so people are getting frustrated that you still have like large parts of countries that only have 6 hours of electricity a day. Or another challenge that's happening in Africa is some people want to approach different approaches agriculture that are culturally not accepted in order to grow new food. And so my point is that if you can constrain the conversation to a smaller organization, your success is much likelier because there are pockets where these innovations can happen. And you think about it, that's how innovation happens in the US. But we don't notice differences because it's a whole cultural model that's built on innovation. And so we're not going to get that in parts of Africa, or we're not going to get parts of Asia, or things like that. But if we can just find little pockets that innovation can flourish in a capital investment that has a favorable, return on investment, then all of a sudden I think it can flourish differently. But to your point, the Chinese just did the same thing the Americans did.
Yeah, in terms of innovation, my experience has also been, I think the West, hey, I'm Mexican, no one can call me a racist, but I think the West it's got a bigger culture of it. Because when I taught even in Mexico, I was trying to innovate like a crazy person as a professor, and I was told by some of my Mexican higher ups like, slow down. Or when I was in Kazakhstan, we were trying to like just break on through to the other side, to quote Jim Morrison. We were just trying to innovate, and these folks were from the former communist world, former Soviet Union, where they don't have this culture of innovating. So we just all the doors kept being shut, and we couldn't really do much. That's not to say it's not happening, but I feel just it's less a part of a culture and less. But I think China is. I think they are doing wonders now. If I could, and corruption, like when I was living in Kazakhstan in Astana, they had this joint China Kazakh project to build the above ground train from the airport all the way through to the capital of the city. And this would have been 4+ years ago since I've been there, but it was left unfinished for years because of corruption. I don't know from which side, where the money just disappeared, and it just stood there unfinished, kind of like that track is in California. I'm sure you've heard there's like this short track of rail that's cost billions or something.
Yeah, but again, I think the other part of the problem is that like the model of large scale, institutional capital investment has failed time and time again.
Do you have any thoughts on the Middle East with the supply chain, with the whole Israel, Lebanon, Yemen, Iran? You got the Houthis in the Red Sea. There's fears of oil infrastructure being attacked, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. I'm not sure if that's going to happen. That would really hurt Iran as well as the West and the whole world. But just any thought when it comes to supply chains and Houthi rebels and pirates and all that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One thing that's gone unnoticed is the extent that the United States has become the world's fossil fuel superpower. Like it just continues to increase the amount of refined oil, gas, liquefied natural gas that we can produce in the world. I think I read, despite Iran being a big producer, it's only 1% of the entire world's oil production. It's unfortunate about what's happening there, and it's creating disturbances in supply chains. But I mean, if someone said to you 5 years ago that there was going to be a major war in Russia and there would be, penalties put on Russian oil, and then the Middle East is the way it is right now, you would think that the economies would have collapsed. There was that whole conversation of what's going to happen to oil prices when the Ukraine war starts and then the Middle East. And yet oil prices are pretty stable. And so what you're seeing is that you're seeing, countries like the United States, which is, just becoming just the world's, energy superpower when it comes to this. So it's one of those things, like I was mentioning with what happened last week with those two hurricanes, is that it sounded like it was going to be much worse than it is, and it's really not having that big of an impact on the world economy.
I think that's an excellent point, especially, if you listen to some of alternative media, independent media analysis, it's always like the sky is falling scenario. And I don't doubt at some point in the future, the sky might actually begin to fall the way we're going, nuclear war or whatever. But you made a good point that this is happening with Ukraine, Russia, Europe, Middle East, but life is just seeming to continue on normal. Even here in Mexico, like I still can't understand how politicians' heads are being chopped off, 50 hijackings of semi trucks a day, on and on. But I'm still living here normally. It's just kind of like I it's like the bombs. It's like in one of those movies, Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers, where bombs are flying and you can just walk, normally through all of that, and life goes on. But any thoughts on which regions you think will do better or worse when it comes to supply chains and globalization?
I think the Western Hemisphere is going to become an enormous supply chain player, and the only area that I'm concerned about is Mexico, because I think everything we just talked about, like the perfect scenario for supply chain would be the U.S. and Mexico become like the hub of supply chain, and Mexico is becoming more sophisticated, but Mexico handles more of the lower price commodity stuff, not by Mexico itself, but Mexico using the rest of Latin and South America in order to become like the low cost producers of clothing and everything like that. Of course, the problem is the cartels, right? And that's the problem there. Southeast Asia continues to be very prominent. I think India is probably the country to watch because India's infrastructure is getting better, which has always been a problem in India. So they're starting to become much bigger in manufacturing, where before they were the services industry that would focus on software and customer support and everything like that. Vietnam is another country that's becoming a real powerhouse. I have hope for Africa, and the country to watch really right now is Kenya. Kenya is becoming really valuable and important when it comes to manufacturing. My big hope is Nigeria. So I've tried to look at working on some projects in Nigeria. Problem you have with Nigeria is bad government, heavily reliant on oil, and then this divide between the North and the South, where the North is Islam and the South is Christian. So you kind of have it's not really one country. But it's really becoming like, we keep using the term Silicon Valley of Africa, Silicon Valley of Mexico. And so that country has enormous potential. And so I think I have a lot of hope for a lot of these places. You're starting to see countries become more than just mineral factories, which is really impressive. So, I mean, I think just like what you said earlier, I'm more hopeful than negative. I think the only thing that's negative here is that these geopolitics lead to confrontations that are completely unnecessary. And what's ironic here is that countries say that they're in favor of addressing the climate problem, and yet war and geopolitical conflict is the worst thing you could do to the planet. So if we really believe in these things, we should stand by them and become a little bit more rational. It doesn't mean that the world's going to act as a global community, but it does mean that countries should be acting in their own best interests relative to longer term challenges. And one more thing I want to mention, I'm sorry I'm rambling a little bit here, is the whole question of depopulation. I mentioned earlier that 2/3 of the countries have a lower than necessary population rate. So in order for a population to stay stable, every woman needs to have 2.1 children. And so most countries are under that number, and some countries are actually going negative. I think it's like Korea, a couple of these nations. This is another alarming trend in the global economy. And it's also, if you couple that with challenges that are happening with the climate, it's leading to a lot of migration issues. And this is another benefit for the Western Hemisphere, particularly the United States, is we're so good at bringing in immigrants in order to keep our population stable. So that's a good thing. I think a lot of people in the United States would prefer our immigration system to be a little more rational. But the countries that are going to be able to adopt immigration in order to address this population issue are also ones that are going to win.
Yeah, I think the IMF, I shared that the IMF just posted a report on the drastic decline of population fertility. Even in my home of Croatia, it's just plummeting. Many countries, but I'm just curious at this point. My view has always been, I mean, I believe some elites in some parts of the world have still this Malthusian worldview, but my view is that I feel like I'm just common sense here. Like, I think people should have children as they see fit. And like, I personally don't think it's a big deal if the population declines. Like we don't have to keep growing. I think people should just have children as they see fit, and whether it goes up or down, it goes up or down. Like I think sometimes I read in the papers, it's like, no, we have to keep growing to 7 or 8, and I feel like, why? Let people have as many kids as they want. But is the point here? We have an economy, a global economy that's built on this population. So if we do start declining, then so many things are going to fall apart. Is that the greatest danger?
Yeah, the challenge you have is not only is there a declining birth rate, but there's an increase in how long people are living, right? So you have, even if you look at the population, it's staying pretty steady. But it's just because people are living longer, and people who are younger are more productive. And so that's the challenge. Now, some people say, yeah, you can replace those people with artificial intelligence and robots. Then you don't have to worry about it. But it's not a supply issue, it's a demand issue. And the challenge that China is facing is not that they can't produce the robots, they have automated ports and all that kind of stuff, is that they don't have enough consumers to keep the economy healthy.
Right, the robots cannot consume. They don't have demand for stuff. Maybe they can pay the robots and just automate. Have the robots buy stuff. I don't know. Come up with something like that. A quick thought on Europe. Any thought on Europe when it comes to the supply chain?
Oh my. You're from Europe. I got my PhD in Sweden. Europe is becoming a very, it's 500 million people, so it's still a sufficient part of the world. But the war in Ukraine was just a real bad thing for Europe. I mean, we talk about production capacity, right? You basically cut off their gas station. They cut off their natural gas from Russia, and Germany, being an economic manufacturing superpower, is going away. And I think the challenge you have is that, unlike the United States, which has a a culture based on immigration, you don't have that same culture in Europe, where when you receive in immigrants, you don't adopt them in the same way. And then the other problem you have is you have this concept called the European Union, which is not is not a bastion of innovation to any extent. And so there really isn't a leader. I mean, if you think about who is the leader of the EU, I mean, in the past it's been Angela Merkel or someone like that who stepped up. And I mean, tell me who you think the leader is of the EU right now.
Isn't it Frau Ursula Gertrude von der Leyen?
She's a bureaucrat.
Right. Yeah.
Like who's really driving the leadership of the continent to say this is where we're heading? I mean, you could say a lot of things about Angela Merkel, but she basically had a path, of what of Europe would be, and you just don't have that right now.
Yeah, it's like a ship without a captain, and it is just stifling. I mean, I've been complaining about this on air. The entry-exit system now is coming into being, and so now you have to pay €10, fill out a social credit form, be approved to be able to fly to Europe. Like, how is that for innovation? Before you could just buy a ticket and go to Europe and do business or travel, and now they're just making more and more steps. That's that's not good for.
Yeah. So like you mentioned, I work in the beer industry, and I was at a conference and we were talking about innovation. And the problem in some countries is they're having crop failures, or given drought and climate change and stuff like that. So we started talking about GMO crops. Crops, they're not Frankenstein at all. Basically, are just modified so that they can grow with less water. And just from a regulatory standpoint, it's not allowed. So like it really isn't the same. I mean, it may have the same culture as the United States, but it doesn't have the same innovation culture.
Well, we'll see what happens. Any other thought for us? Anything we haven't brought up?
Well, I mean, I say this to my students. I want people to look at this as an opportunity. I mean, like you mentioned, I mean, there's parts of the world that are on fire, but there's parts that you can really look at and say, wow, there's some real opportunities. I mean, you talked about Mexico. Mexico is an example of tremendous opportunities amidst people getting their heads cut off, right? You look at certain parts of that, like I think Kenya is just amazing, like what the possibilities are in places like this. So I think there's hope. And so as we move forward, let's just hope that comes our shining light instead of just all the other problems.
No, I think that is a great point to end on. That even here in Mexico, I mean, there's people that I see that are Mexicans or foreigners who are doing or extremely successful in business in other areas. So I think it's just the onus is on us, on each person to go around. Part of it is luck and timing and opportunity and who but there's opportunities all over the place, even in Mexico. I'm still here. It hasn't gotten that bad for me to leave yet, and so I'm not a mayor, so I'm not getting my head chopped off. That's if you're not involved with that stuff, typically you're left alone. So your book was published your latest book was published a few months back, Environmental Innovation. And last time, again, I highly recommend your book, Reinventing the Supply Chain. And where are the best places people can find you or projects you have?
Well, the company we're talking about that is in charge of everything is Amazon. Now I'm really hoping to one day in the future talk to you about this project in Africa or some of these projects in the inner city. It's a moonshot because you have to get through a lot of outdated thinking. But I really do think that these could really change how communities multiply. And that's what happened in the United States, in the industrial revolutions. You had these Detroit, Baltimore, these industrial zones became multipliers for the entire country. So hope one day to come back and tell you the good story. And until then, I'll just keep fighting.
We can do a Zoom from Africa, and you can give us a boots on the ground report. Well, all of your links to your stuff are in the description. And as always, great chatting. Thanks for coming back, Jack.
I enjoyed the conversation, Ray.